Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to episode 4 of the Guyana Business Journal and Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar series, Transforming Guyana. I am Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York and founder of the Guyana Business Journal. And I'm joined by Dr. David Lewis of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and Manchester Trade Incorporated. As many of you are aware, this series brings together experts and prominent voices from Guyana, the Caribbean, and the diaspora to discuss the impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development. We aim to offer a nuanced look at the opportunities and potential pitfalls ahead for Guyana, and we explore strategies to maximize the positive impacts of the oil revenues on Guyana's people and future, while mitigating the risks that other countries have faced in this transition. Today, we want to examine Guyana's emergence as a petrostate and its implications for the Venezuela-Essequibo controversy. In responding to comments about the advertising for this program, I was asked whether or not Guyana was indeed a petrostate, and so to define what I meant by petrostate, or what was meant by petrostate. And so for us, a petrostate is simply a nation whose economy is heavily dependent on the extraction and export of oil or natural gas. And I think in this regard, we're correct. 2020 data says that the top exports for Guyana are crude petroleum, gold, rice, railway cargo containers, and we explore primarily to the United States, Canada, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and surprisingly for me, the United Arab Emirates. It turns out that about 39.1% of our total exports correspond to crude oil and 22% gold. So 39, 40 plus 22, about 60% of our exports are crude oil and gold. So we're not just a petrostate, we are, as it were, a golden petrostate. And so today, what we want to do is to discuss and to think about how our continuing trajectory as a golden petrostate will be informed by the Essequibo Venezuela controversy. And today's conversation will be led by Mr. Carl Greenidge, former Minister of Finance, Planning and Trade of Guyana, and former Second Vice President, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Secretary of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Professor Ivelaw Lloyd Griffith, the 10th Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Guyana, served from 2016 through 2019. Professor Griffith was the 9th President of Fort Valley State University in Georgia, and he's the tenured professor of political science here in the City University of New York and served as provost and senior vice president at York College in the City University of New York. I should note that Professor Griffith is a political scientist of some repute. He earned his PhD at the University of New York Graduate School, and he is an expert on Caribbean and hemispheric security. We're also joined by Professor Anthony Bryan, a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and a senior fellow with the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine in Trinidad and Tobago. He is a founding member of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and has worked as a scholar on energy development, energy security, and energy geopolitics in the Caribbean and in the three Guyanas, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana, for regional governments and for national oil companies. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Riyad Insanally, Guyana's 8th Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to the United States of America and the 4th Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States. Ambassador Insanally is a career diplomat who joined Guyana's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1990. Before this, he was the OAS representative in Trinidad and Tobago, 2008 to 16, and an advisor to the OAS Assistant Secretary General in Washington, D.C. I should note, and that Ambassador Insanally was also a lecturer in the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Guyana. He studied modern languages and Latin American studies and holds a doctoral degree, MA and MPhil degrees from the University of Cambridge and a PhD from Harvard. So we have gathered together what David and I thought was a dream team to give some context to where we are today in the Venezuela-Essequibo controversy. And so before we get into this, what I want to just broadly outline where we're going. What we want to do is sort of, what are the critical elements of the controversy? A kind of update as to where we are towards a kind of binding resolution in this regard. To think of some geopolitical imperatives for Guyana. You know, why is this Venezuelan claim sort of an existential threat? You know, what are some local and global imperatives that warrant pursuit as we manage this circumstance? And then to kind of have a lens from the Caribbean, and to have a lens from in particular from Trinidad and Tobago, and then finally to close on some, you know, foreign policy imperatives for Guyana, and broadly a perspective from the U.S. policymaking ecosystem. So let me take this opportunity to welcome you once again and to invite Dr. David Lewis to offer a few introductory remarks, which will be followed by Mr. Greenidge's presentation. David?
Thank you, Terrence. Colleagues on the webinar, guests who are watching us from the Caribbean, the United States, internationally. It's a pleasure to have this discussion today with such an esteemed group of colleagues, but more importantly, friends in the vineyard of Caribbean foreign affairs and international relations over the decades. I would just add a couple of points with regards to Terrence's introduction as we lead the discussion, focusing really on not just the oil and gas existential anxieties, as I think we had in one of the summaries with regards to this controversy, but really where it fits in terms of what is now clearly a medium long-term new global energy crisis, and the role that countries that are producing oil and gas like Guyana and Venezuela have in the sense of a need for all producers, particularly in the Americas, to be engaged and developing this new resource, both in terms of exploration and production, but then most importantly, commercialization efforts. We're looking at the next 3 decades of an approximate $150 billion of revenue for Guyana in this sector, and the importance that that has not only for its national economy, but the regional Caribbean economy, and then of course the linkage with Venezuela as another oil and gas producer is critical. So something to add in to the foreign policy, the geography, the geopolitical situation is really the role of what I would call energy business convergence with the political controversy issues as a complement and or on the margin, just because, as we've seen in many other instances in global foreign affairs, many times the opportunity for growing business and resource gain is something to build bridges on and to have convergence, not to mention in this case of Guyana and Venezuela, but even broadly the Caribbean and Venezuela, the geographic closeness and in this case contiguity. So I think that's just one additional perspective to add in, and I'm all ears and with full appetite this morning to listen to my friends and colleagues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And so we'll go to, say, Professor Greenidge in this regard. I once heard this really wonderful talk that he gave at Medgar Evers College, and this is sort of also part of the reason that I think it would be, you know, that he will serve us well this morning. So, Mr. Greenidge, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Professor Blackman, and may I also say good morning to colleagues and your audience. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to join such a distinguished panel to discuss this particular issue of the Guyana-Venezuela controversy, the court case, and the issues surrounding Guyana's development and its future. May I take the opportunity to begin, however, with a word along these lines. Your audience would have noticed that recently the former foreign minister of Guyana, who served as our PR to the UN and also had been permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and served under Srinath Ramphal, for example, as PS, died last week. And I'm speaking of Rashleigh Esmond Jackson, who served, he was the longest serving foreign minister we've had. And in his time, he was the second longest serving foreign minister in Latin America and the Caribbean. And he was very closely associated, of course, with the non-aligned movement in particular, and the issue before us, which is of national sovereignty and the multilateral system in general. He was, up to the time of his death, a member of an advisory committee looking at the preparation of the court case. And we are very sad to have lost him. And at the same time, that death has been followed by that of Professor Duke Pollard, who was also a member of that team and former member of the Caribbean Court of Justice. So I just wanted to open on that note. The issue of what for a long time, certainly post 1966, has been referred to as the controversy between Guyana and Venezuela, is still with us, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to say a few words about it. I will start by addressing the nature of this dispute, not wanting to go through the entire history, but to say to you that the dispute between Guyana and Venezuela, yes, it has a long history, but it was actually resolved in 1899, resolved and embraced from 1899 until 1962, when the matter was formally raised in a bid, it appears, to prevent Guyana's independence and other issues. Since then, the matter has been captured, or the resolution of the matter has been captured within the framework of an agreement between Venezuela and Britain in the first instance, and an agreement to which Guyana embraced within the same year, 1966, an agreement that basically is intended to deal with the failure of the two countries coming out of the framework that has been established under that agreement, which says basically, if the joint commission that the two countries are to form to look at the contention by Venezuela that the 1899 award is null and void, if that commission after 4 years does not satisfactorily resolve the matter, then a set of processes can be engaged. We can go into the processes later, but those processes are globally accepted, and indeed the steps or the means that one often refers to are taken from the UN Charter, Article 33. So although it is a bilateral agreement, it builds on or utilizes internationally accepted framework for resolution. And that framework has all the usual elements in there: mediation, resolution, and the possibility of going to third parties. The end of that process, or the process led to the court now, because having exhausted the good offices process, which was to be performed by the Secretary General of the UN, and the Secretary General of the UN having identified mutually acceptable, prominent individuals, 4 of whom had served, and all of whom were Caribbean people, we ended in 2015 without a resolution. And when I say without a resolution, meaning in 2015, there was a complaint by Guyana to the UN Secretary General, first of all, that this process was largely a failure in the sense that it had not resolved the matter. And more importantly, and that was done as early as October 2014, but subsequently with a new government in place in 2015, that new government complained to the SG that the Venezuelan government had placed along its maritime borders, Guyana's maritime borders, and along land borders, armed troops, some of whom were breaching those frontiers. And that action led to the Secretary General inviting both presidents to meet with him and to discuss peacefully, in keeping with the 1966 Geneva Agreement, how this matter might be resolved. The Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, agreed at the time with Guyana that this matter, which had been the subject of an international arbitration panel in 1899, could not simply be deemed null by one party, which party itself had enjoyed the benefit of the very decision of 1899. And therefore, he urged that some dialogue be facilitated, and that in the course of that dialogue, we agree to work assiduously to clear up the matter of the controversy. That process took 2 years, and a good deal of the time was spent in the Secretary General trying to find or identify somebody acceptable to Venezuela, who was not to be interviewed by the Venezuelan president before being chosen, somebody that could serve as a new interlocutor, whatever process it was that the SG and the parties agreed to. After the failure to find somebody acceptable in that sense, after nearly 18 months, in 2016, the Secretary General identified Ambassador Dag Newlander to undertake this task. And Newlander had, you might recall, being the ambassador involved in trying to resolve the problem between Colombia and Venezuela. So he was known to Venezuela, and it seemed had the confidence of Venezuela. That exercise continued, and it was informed by a letter sent by the SG to the 2 presidents, explaining that this process was to be called a process of enhanced mediation. Enhanced mediation. And it would involve, first of all, the personal representative of the Secretary General, that is Dag Newlander, carrying out his own assessment and trying to find ways forward. And at the end of that period, he would report to the SG. And on the basis of that report, the SG would either refer the matter to the ICJ, or he would not refer the matter, and he wouldn't refer the matter if the 2 countries wrote him saying that it should not be referred to the ICJ. That is as brief a summary of how we got to the court as I can make. And when the exercise was completed, at the beginning of 2017, the SG wrote to the two presidents. And having received our letter, Guyana then consulted with its legal advisors and then approached the court in keeping with the process that we'd gone through, the process agreed by Venezuela, and in keeping with the decision of the SG. So, if you like, I'm making some very clear points here, in my view, completely indisputable. First of all, that there was a resolution of a dispute in 1899, which Venezuela embraced by signing, by enshrining in its own procedures in Caracas, that they did publicly announce that they would no longer embrace that agreement, and that the process as set out in the Geneva Agreement, which the Venezuelans seem to treat as the Bible, when in fact the 1966 agreement merely outlines a process for resolution. It says, actually, it makes no mention of Essequibo anywhere. It makes no mention of land transfer anyway. And after 1970, that process says nothing about what the Guyana can do or cannot do with Essequibo. Nothing like that is said in the agreement. And so I want that to be clear. There was a process, and I'm saying this now, what I'm going to say, because a number of commentators have tended to say, well, you know, perhaps it is time the two countries have some dialogue, and they're now trying to suggest that alternative processes be utilized. What I'm saying to you quite definitively is that all the processes known to the international community, which processes say, which if bilaterals can't agree, you will have to have some form of third party involvement. That involvement has been triggered. It was triggered, and we had a situation in which Venezuela claimed that the SG exceeded its powers. In fact, the persons making the decision here was not Mr. Ban Ki-moon or Antonio Guterres, but both of them. Both Secretary Generals were party to this process, separately and then jointly and then individually. Now it is SG Guterres. And the matter of the complaint went to the court. It was not unilateral because, one, it was part of a process agreed, and two, the court itself has a process for examining a contentious case. This is a contentious case in the sense that the two parties did not agree to come to the court. The two parties have been working on this matter for several decades and have been completely unable to arrive at an agreement. And at the end of the discussions, chaired by Doug Newlander, we ended up far wider than we began than we were at even in 1966. And that is a background that needs to be understood. So calling upon us to continue talking or demanding good offices processes are essentially no-goes. They're a waste of time, because if you can't resolve a matter like this in such a long period, even if you start with 1966, you're not going to be able to do it in 2 weeks. And it is the continuation along these lines is a recipe for problems and worse. The court required, or the court rules require, that as a first step in such a case, that it decides on jurisdiction. And that process was undertaken beginning in 2018. And in 2020, the court gave a decision as regards its findings. And basically, whereas Venezuela was contending that it had never agreed to go to the court was not named in the 1966 agreement and stuff like this. The court was of the view, and it was decided by one of the larger of the majorities. You don't normally get as many as 8 judges voting for a decision, and that and bear in mind that some of those who voted against the decision, or some of those who gave written reservations, didn't actually challenge whether Venezuela had in fact agreed. I think that was fairly widely accepted. That was accepted by all of them, except 2 that said, well, Venezuela having agreed, the court should go back to Venezuela to ask Venezuela's opinion as to whether they could come to the court. Now, with all respect to the due to our distinguished judges, this poses problems. It clearly poses a problem for the court, that if the 2 parties never agreed to discuss the matter, never agreed to go to the court in the first instance, now asking one of them whether they agreed is largely not going to be helpful. So this was not a unilateral decision by Guyana. It was not ultra vires on the part of either Guyana or of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Venezuela had agreed to this process, and it had started that process. The court having agreed that it has jurisdiction, but let me say that the request going to the court had asked the court to pronounce on matters such as the court deemed took place after 1966, and therefore they didn't want to pronounce on actions that Venezuela might have taken after 1966. So the court has indicated that it will restrict itself to whether or not the 1899 agreement was ultra vires or not. And the reason why I emphasize that is that because of the petroleum issue, the issue of the exploration of the maritime space, there's a tendency by the press, which sees petroleum as a more sexy area, to focus on this matter as though it is a dispute between Guyana and Venezuela over the maritime space. In the first instance, it does not concern the maritime space. It concerns the land boundary. And may I say, the claim by Venezuela as regards this land boundary amounts to 3/4, 74% of Guyana's land surface. I don't think, with the exception of what now seems to be the claim of Russia in relation to Ukraine, I'm sure that no claim or no territorial claim that currently exists involves such a demand. It is, when added to the claims by Suriname, would leave us with practically no Guyana at all. The maritime space is a separate matter, but of course, if you remember that the law, international law, says that your maritime space is defined by the land boundary and in particular by the coast, then it does have implications, but in the first instance, it is not a judgment as to whether or not a particular piece of maritime space belongs to Guyana. It's not a question of whether Guyana can continue to exploit the petroleum resources lying offshore, and it is expected that this phase of the court case, which is a phase that now involves or should involve an examination of the substance of the case, it has had a new element of time added to it by a complaint laid on the very last day, which the law law allows, and that is Venezuela, in response to Guyana's memorial setting out Guyana's case. It's a funny case because it isn't Guyana that is making the claim, it's Venezuela that's making the claim that the agreement is null and void, that the arbitration award is null and void. But given how the court works, it is Guyana that has to anticipate Venezuela's complaint. And so the first memorial submitted by Guyana in March of 2021 has to be followed. Sorry, March of 2022 has to be followed by a memorial from Venezuela in March of 2023. It did not submit a memorial in Venezuela didn't submit a memorial in 21, and so it, however, has complained about Guyana's memorial. The court is now going to sit and pronounce on that complaint. That is where we are now. I don't want to enter the specifics of the complaint, but that is where we are now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that guidance and for that brief sketch of where we are. And I think it's important, as you have emphasized, that in some sense things have already been decided, and so there's a kind of spurious quality to the claim, but it nonetheless is a reality, and so we have to think about how this gets managed. And also, I think we also have to think about educating the community in terms of, what the issues are, so that there's a broad consensus and an understanding among the Guyanese populace as to what we're facing, and as part perhaps of the educational function, I wanted to bring in here Professor Ivelaw Griffith to give us some thoughts in this regard. So thank you again, Mr. Foreign Secretary. Thank you. Professor Griffith.
Thank you, Terrence, and wonderful job by Carl Greenidge. Thank you for that wonderful historical reference. We can begin the slides when you're ready, Terrence. We can go back to the first one. That would be good. Can we go to the next slide, please? I want to begin really by thanking you, Terrence and David, for the invitation, but also to applaud you and our respective organizations, Caribbean Policy Consortium, of which I also am a founding member, and the Guyana Business Journal, for this series, which is an educational opportunity writ large for a variety of constituencies within and beyond Guyana. And what I thought I'll do with my 12 or so minutes is to focus on two questions. Is there a way of making this slide larger, Terrence? I want to spend a little time asking the question and responding to it. Why is Venezuela's claim an existential matter, an existential threat to our native land, Guyana? But then go beyond that to pose a second question and respond to a second question. And that question is, what are some local and global imperatives that warrant pursuit by Guyana as Guyana manages this existential threat? Don't know if we can make the slides larger, but if not, we can go to the second slide. But as I think it's important to call to mind what Voltaire, French philosopher Voltaire, reminded us of the importance of defining your terms. Voltaire used to drive people crazy by saying, before you can have this conversation, sir, define your terms. And I think it's important in asking the question about why is the claim an existential threat, maybe wise to pause and, remembering Voltaire, to define what we mean by existential threat. And I'm just going to relay what the Britannica Dictionary, which I embrace, defines as an existential threat. And it's simply this: a threat to a people's existence or survival. And you'll see in a minute that the claim by Venezuela, the nature, the character, the implications of that claim runs up against Guyana surviving as a nation. So we're talking about an existential threat, a threat that goes against the grain of survival of the land of Guyana. Next slide, please. Now, if you ask the question, what is it that makes a nation? What is it that makes Guyana a nation? I think there are at least 4 factors. There's a land factor, there's a people factor, there's a resource factor, and there's an identity factor. And I'll share with you in a minute, for each of those factors, what the implications of this claim are, and why the claim itself, given its implications, is an existential threat. So let's go to the first issue, the land matter. And we heard from Carl Greenidge that we're not talking about a minuscule claim. Venezuela is claiming everything west of the Essequibo River as part of its patrimony. And when you ask the question, well, what does that represent in actuality? In actuality, it represents 74% of Guyana's 83,000 square miles. It represents 61,000 plus square miles of Guyana's 83,000. If you were to take the administrative division of Guyana into 10 regions and ask the question, how many of Guyana's administrative regions lie within Essequibo? The number is 6. In other words, more than half of the number of administrative regions, provinces, some places call them states, some places call them, are within that Essequibo area. But sometimes it's useful to get a comparative perspective of any reference. And if you were to use a comparative Caribbean reference point and just pick Jamaica, for example, Jamaica can fit into the Essequibo 14.5 times. We're talking about a huge expanse of territory. The Essequibo is about 88, almost 90% of the size of the United Kingdom. In other words, we're not talking about a minuscule area of land. We're talking about a significant proportion of this country called Guyana, which, were that proportion not to be there, would undermine the existence of Guyana as a sovereign entity. Now, we also know, and this is part of the existential dimension, and Carl Greenidge referred to it, that the Venezuela claim is not the only claim against Guyana. We have on the Eastern Front a claim from Suriname for about 15,000 square kilometers. So if you were to remove from Guyana the Essequibo, you'd be left with about 21,400 square miles, which is about half the size of Cuba. In other words, colleagues, we're talking about a significant set of implications insofar as the land dimension of a nation is concerned with this claim by Venezuela. But the implications go beyond land to go to people. You were to ask the question, what's Guyana's population? The world population clock says as of this year, Guyana has a little over 800,000 people. And you ask the question, how many of those 800,000 live in Essequibo? You have a little over 300,000. So you're talking about a significant part of the nation's populace being in this region that is claimed by another nation. And we all know that Guyana is a multinational, multiracial society, significant to which are the indigenous, the First Peoples of Guyana. There are 9 First Peoples. I list them there in the slide. A significant proportion of those indigenous people, those First Peoples, live within this place called Essequibo. So there are significant implications not only for the land, but for the people component of our nation. Next slide, please. Of course, we know that there are significant resource implications. We know that within this Essequibo, not only as a conversation, Minister Carl Greenidge referenced this, conversation tends to go to the maritime part of Guyana's oil reserve, but they are oil resources on the land in Essequibo. I remember in the early days, the Takatu Basin was a conversation point back in the 70s. But not only are there resources of oil on the land in Guyana, separate and apart from the maritime resources off the coast, Guyana has the gold and the diamond and the bauxite. Guyana has manganese, and yes, Guyana also has uranium. I wrote a study last year for Florida International and CPC project showing exactly where Guyana's uranium is, in that Guyana-Venezuela area. But there's a significant biodiversity in that Essequibo area connected to the Guyana Shield, which spans Guyana, Venezuela, part of Colombia, goes all the way east to a part of French Guyana. And so we're talking about significant resource implications, separate and apart from the minerals that are there. There is timber, there's agricultural land. But let's go to the next slide, because we're not done with the implications. A nation's importance relates to its identity. And significant to that identity are not only the people and the resources, but identity relating to things about its culture, culture in regards to its food, culture in regard to its places. And I was only recently reviewing for another project I'm doing songs that are national songs of Guyana. And I was saying to myself, if perhaps, God forbid, that Guyana is no longer in possession of the Essequibo, there are things in some of the national songs that would no longer be part of our identity. A song of Guyana children, for example, born in the land of the mighty Roraima. Well, the Roraima is part of Essequibo. The Kaicho is part of the Essequibo. And so I have there a map of what would be Guyana without the Essequibo. As a matter of fact, you go to certain Venezuelan sites, you will see that they have what they say is Guyana that is even without the Essequibo as it is without here. They show what Guyana is without Essequibo and what Guyana is without Suriname's claim. So there are identity implications that are significant, and we can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Now, the next slide begins the conversation regarding the second question. What are some of the imperatives? What are some of the things that are necessary for Guyana to do, some of which Guyana has begun to do in regard to managing this claim? I list 4 imperatives, some of which have been enjoined already. A judicial imperative, a defense diplomacy imperative, a public education imperative, and a security investment imperative. We can go to the next slide. I wrote a 2-part series recently for Oil Now, where I say the claim by Venezuela for Guyana and the controversy relating to it reminds me of that Samuel Beckett play, Waiting for Godot. And in the context of the waiting game, I list a couple of important milestones, many of which Minister Greenidge, Secretary Greenidge, Professor Greenidge has identified. And I think it's important for us to recognize that the claim is going to be executed. Godot will arrive insofar as my analogy of Godot being the ICJ. But there's a waiting game, elements of which began with March 29 when Guyana filed its application. And I can tell you with pride, I'm delighted having read both Guyana's application and the judgment of the course in 2020. It is a proud moment to be Guyanese and to see the team that Guyana has assembled to prosecute its claim, a team of which Carl Greenidge is the agent of our case. So there's a judicial imperative. That horse is out the barn, and we're hoping that, as we all expect, Guyana will prevail at the end of Godot's arrival with that judicial imperative that is on the way. But let's go to the next slide. And I think Guyana also, and I said in that Oil Now article, Guyana has never sought to put all its eggs in one basket. And so from the time of its national birth in 1966, Guyana has pursued what is called a multi-track foreign policy strategy. Greenidge referred to the great Rashley Jackson, who died September 1st. And Rashley wrote a book in 2003, and I thought I'd share with you just a couple of sentences, one sentence, two sentences actually from that book. And part of Guyana's diplomacy imperative has been what has been called a defense diplomacy. And he said, diplomacy was the first line of defense, as well as an important vehicle for promoting cooperation. And the defense diplomacy says we've got to manage the international engagement. We've got to manage affairs on the regional and international landscapes as a way to enable people to understand the nature of the claim, understand the nature of the controversy, and understand the rectitude that Guyana finds in maintaining that arbitral award of 1899 October is valid and is binding. And so the diplomacy imperative has been working in Guyana's favor, both in relation to Guyana's claim by Venezuela and the claim by Suriname. But let's go to the next slide. And the next slide says to us that there's a public education imperative. I think it's laudable, some of the things that Guyana has been doing. If you go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you will see part of the website that has a repository of things about the dispute, about the controversy, a repository of documents. But I'm reminded of my first visit to Venezuela more than 4 decades ago, and I was struck by the regularity with which the national anthem, Gloria al Bravo Pueblo, is played. And what Venezuela has been doing for several decades now is making this national issue, this issue of what they call zona en reclamación, an issue that is in the public sphere, in the public mind. They have conducted a significant and consistent public education campaign. I think Guyana has an opportunity to at least catch up. We have not done a consistent and well enough job in that respect. And I think it is not too late for Guyana to embrace a multi-dimensional education campaign. I would ask the question of Guyanese officials, who among the officials in that Essequibo region really understand the extent of this claim, what the implications are? There's an opportunity to educate the citizens using a variety of platforms, a variety of methods. But I think there is a final imperative, and we're running out of time, so I'll just mention it. Guyana cannot afford to attempt to match Venezuela militarily, and it shouldn't try to do that. This is not a contest of a military resolution nature. But Guyana has an obligation to have a security establishment that it can at least serve as a first-level deterrence. We are far from that. I was very pleased to see last year President Ali committing to investing in Guyana's security establishment, not just the defense force, but the other elements of Guyana's security architecture. It was wonderful to see a few weeks ago a visit by some top Brazilian aircraft manufacturers, met with the president himself. It was good to see that early this year, there were purchases from the United States of military helicopters to boost the security establishment. I think it's important that that security investment imperative be part of the package of things that Guyana does in managing this existential threat. Let's go to the final slide. And I want to leave you with the words of a distinguished gentleman who was the first foreign minister of Guyana, as Minister Greenidge mentioned, who is a co-agent of the case that we have prosecuting in the ICJ. This is what he said in a speech at the oral hearing on June 30. And his words to me, as I read them a year or so ago, his words resonate with the sense that this claim is an existential matter. No word of introduction from me can be adequate, Mr. President and eminent judges, without impressing at the outset the singular importance of this case to all the people of Guyana, whose collective patrimony is at the center of this hearing, and who are united in defense of their sovereignty and the territorial integrity of their people. This, to me, comports with the reality of what is, and what is. This matter is an existential matter insofar as Guyana is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Griffith, for that wonderful bit of education, public education imperative, as you appropriately described it, and in a sense, it's a perfect tie-in to the remarks from Professor Bryan. In a sense, you also talked about the diplomacy imperative, and so I suppose in Guyana's near space, it's the Caribbean, and so we wanted to ask Professor Bryan to kind of give some lens from the Caribbean perspective on the Essequibo Venezuela controversy, and given, as you shared with us the remarks of Riyad Ramphal, that this that our collective patrimony is at the center of this hearing, and Guyana is unified in the defense of the sovereignty and territorial integrity. How does this look from the Caribbean space, Professor Bryan?
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. I was trying to unmute. Well, I think the preceding speakers have pretty much wrapped up the Venezuelan threat, as it were, to Guyana. I have to take a slightly different perspective. The perspective, of course, starts with my own country of Trinidad and Tobago. You know, we have always been supportive of Guyana's integrity, and that does not change. And that is the same for CARICOM. And the techniques that we have to use, since we are not military powers, clearly, is a very astute sense of diplomacy. And Carl Greenidge and Rajli Jackson and Riyad Ramphal have certainly been the top tier of the people who carry that through. From the Trinidad point of view, let me say that being aware of the realpolitik of 34 million persons today, 7 miles away, with shared economic and natural resource interests, that is one of the understated linchpins of Trinidad and Tobago's foreign policy with respect to Venezuela. We have a very strict policy of non-interference. We have a strict policy of recognizing whatever government is in power, and we carry on business. But that is the realpolitik. That is the reality of Trinidad and Tobago. So, although there is full support for Guyana's position, we have to be aware of the realpolitik. Let me explain a little more. The oil industry and the natural gas industry, for which there is cross-border cooperation between Trinidad and Venezuela, this is something that really determines at least our economic approach to Venezuela. With the current constraints on domestic production of gas, because Trinidad is basically a gas economy, the government has been actively exploring the possibility of importing pipeline gas from neighboring countries, pass it through the Trinidad infrastructure. In longer term, that sort of gas may be available from Guyana and Suriname. But the most immediate source of natural gas would be from neighboring Venezuela. So exporting gas from Venezuela to Trinidad by pipeline to put through the Atlantic LNG facility, I think to go then to international markets, that is something that is an objective of the Trinidad and Tobago government. And it is an objective which involves the full cooperation of Venezuela. It hasn't proceeded with the pace that we would like to see, simply because we are constrained by the economic sanctions placed on Venezuela. But let's be realistic. With reserves of over 220 trillion cubic feet of gas, Venezuela is one of the world's major sources of gas reserves in addition to oil reserves. By contrast, Trinidad and Tobago, which is great by Caribbean standards, has just over 10 trillion cubic feet of gas. So production of gas in Venezuela has been severely constrained due to its very poor investment climate and the fact that this national oil company has always been interested more in oil than in gas. But despite all of that, what I expect is that Trinidad and Tobago will have to conduct a very, very skillful game of diplomacy with respect to Venezuela and with respect to the claims over the Essequibo region. We are not going to falter. We are a CARICOM country, and we will support Guyana's territorial integrity. As far as the present circumstance is concerned, Trinidad is now the home of about 40,000 Venezuelan migrants and refugees. The government has given legal status to 16,000. The rest are non-registered in the informal economy and hope to be legalized one day, because that legal status in practical terms means the freedom to work, to have access to free health care in public institutions, government assistance, that sort of thing. But there is a reality for us that many Venezuelans are fleeing economic hardships in one of the richest natural resource countries on the planet. And we are not under any illusion in Trinidad and Tobago that many of them intend to return to Venezuela. That is where the heart and the emotions reside. They're going to sort their own politics out. That is not our business. Our business is to conduct relations that are on a stable basis. Now, I am still concerned, as all of you, I suppose, by this Venezuela's claim on Essequibo. I think Ivelaw and Mr. Greenidge have pointed out some of the larger implications. I have another one to put forward. And that is, in 2020, the Venezuelan government ordered its navy to redefine the nation's maritime boundaries and its exclusive economic zone. Now, this was followed almost immediately by the seizure and subsequent release of 12 Guyanese fishermen and their boats by the Venezuelan Navy in February 2021. In what the Guyanese assumed were within its own national maritime boundaries, but the Venezuelans said no. Now that the International Court of Justice has agreed that it can hear Guyana's objections to Venezuelan claim because of dubious treaty obligations signed almost a century ago, the Venezuelans say, it raises the question of whether several independent Caribbean island states may also have to fight legal battles to maintain their maritime sovereignty. Now, the history will record that decolonization in the Caribbean after World War II forced Venezuela to negotiate its maritime boundaries with several neighboring states, including former colonial territories. For example, Great Britain ceded the Abyss Rock, or Bird Island as it's called, off Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean. Will Venezuela now push its territorial claims in the Caribbean based on this almost submersible strip of land? I simply ask the question. The point is that kind of claim over the Essequibo might open up claims in other areas. So it's not only a threat to Guyana, it probably is a threat to many other places. Are you going to cut me off as early?
No, I'm listening. I'm just cueing that will come up in a moment, but it just, yeah, so continue, please continue.
Okay, let me then conclude with the CARICOM view. The one important experience that CARICOM has had has been with the Petrocaribe Agreement, which went through the 70s to the 90s, in which certain Caribbean countries received oil and gas assistance from TNT. And then in July 2005, Venezuela launched the Petrocaribe Initiative, which undercut TNT's energy diplomacy. Now, this agreement was very troublesome because there were separate agreements with Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica. Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados never signed the agreement. The Manning government of TNT was angered by the pilgrimage, as he called it, of CARICOM states to Caracas. Trinidad's petroleum refinery had 56% of its sales of petroleum products in the Caribbean disappear. Phoenix gas processors, the same thing. So what Petrocaribe became in the CARICOM experience again was the largest debt accumulator by Caribbean countries to Venezuela. We could spend a lot of time on telling you what went wrong with Petrocaribe. But my bottom line is that in view of Venezuela's suggestion that Petrocaribe can be resumed, I would urge not. We should never repeat the same mistake again as the Maduro government is suggesting. So finally, my bottom line, what the Caribbean needs is very vision of regional energy cooperation or integration. At its best, such a policy would integrate the region's energy policy into trade, to economic, to environmental, security, and foreign policies. It would broaden dialogue with producing and consuming nations alike. So the alternative scenario is that consuming countries will continue to feed heightened insecurity over access to supplies, creating an opportunity for the politicians, not the companies and the technocrats, to enact curious policies under the guise of promoting energy security. So the regional leaders have to consider the establishment of a unit, perhaps within the regional bureaucracy, as a mechanism for maintaining this sort of relations with countries that produce oil. So I want to leave it at that and say that two things: fully supportive of Guyana's integrity, whether it's Trinidad, whether it's CARICOM. And in fact, if I look at the Essequibo dispute in some realpolitik terms, there's hardly a chance that Venezuela would attempt an adventure in which Guyana's resources have now been bolstered by the interests of international oil companies, by governments such as Brazil and the United States, to say nothing of the diplomacy of CARICOM and others. I think Guyana is in safe hands, and regardless of what the Venezuelans would or would not want to do. But I did what I did, Terrence, to indicate that Venezuela does have a story behind it. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, as you rightly identified, there is a realpolitik that is in play, and the sense is that your judgment at this moment is that there's no chance that there's an adventure planned on the part of the Venezuelans. But I hasten to say that in this moment, we see an adventure from the Russian government in the Ukraine, and one might have thought it completely impossible for such a thing to emerge. And so, Ambassador Insanally, is how do we ensure that as we play this game of realpolitik, that Guyana is able to sort of ensure that she is aligned with the appropriate strategic partners in the global diplomatic sense?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Terrence. Thanks to you and David for the kind invitation to sit on such a distinguished panel. Obviously, we are addressing not just an existential issue for Guyana, but one that I believe is the most critical existential issue for Guyana, and one that I have dealt with in varying degrees throughout my diplomatic career in Guyana's Foreign Service from 1990 to 2021. And in that respect, allow me, please, just to pay tribute to the memory of Rashid Jackson, who was my first foreign minister and who has been recognized as one of the key figures in using diplomacy as our first line of defense against the Venezuelan threat. Coming so late in the batting order means that there's very little that I can add to what my colleagues have articulated so eloquently before me. I'm not sure why I've been asked to present a perspective from the US policy-making ecosystem, as that is not my natural habitat, but I can certainly try to outline some key imperatives for Guyana from a broader perspective, and in the context of the continuing importance of diplomacy as Guyana's first line of defense against Venezuela, even as we pursue our case at the International Court of Justice. The first point I'd like to make is that while we place our faith in the rule of international law and are perhaps cautiously optimistic that our outstanding team of international lawyers can deliver the judgment that we Guyanese all desire in settling the controversy finally and definitively, we cannot rely on the ICJ alone. Considerable diplomatic efforts have to be made to complement the legal process, as the Venezuelans, both the Maduro regime and the opposition, are actively promoting their own warped, self-serving, and fallacious interpretation of the 1899 award, the Geneva Agreement, and the ICJ process. We have to be cognizant of Venezuela propaganda, and we have to counter all this with nimble and proactive diplomacy to keep our allies on side, keep those who would prefer to be neutral informed, and to counter the Venezuelan narrative among those who are not so favorably disposed towards us. In this respect, it should be standard operating procedure for our political leadership, our diplomatic representatives, and other government officials to present the truth about the 1899 award and the strength of our case, even as they remain alert to Venezuela's propensity for spreading misinformation and fake news at every opportunity in multilateral forums, academic settings, think tanks, and so on. At both the national and international levels, we cannot afford to take anything for granted. I believe that the experience of Chile in the maritime dispute with Peru, settled by the ICJ, is instructive. I'm sure Carl remembers well the meeting we had a few years ago with the Chilean ambassador in Washington, along with two key members of Chile's legal team. We came away with some extremely useful recommendations, but unfortunately circumstances prevented the implementation of a strategy that would both underpin and complement the ICJ process. But here are some of the lessons learned, which I think are still relevant today. While the issue is now predominantly a legal one, it is also very much a political one. National unity in Guyana on the matter of our border with Venezuela is not in doubt, but it has to go beyond rhetoric and singing not a blade of grass, and it should be reinforced at every available opportunity. Both Terrence and Ivelaw have talked about the importance of public education.
Chile created a bipartisan team of lawyers and historians to shape the national narrative. There were also meetings of former presidents and foreign ministers aimed at informing strategy and reinforcing a national consensus. There are periodic briefings and a process of consultation at the national level, which involved all sectors, but particularly the Supreme Court, the armed forces, academia, and civil society. All this because national unity was deemed to be of the utmost strategic importance in the presentation of Chile's position to the international community. And while we do not doubt the integrity of the judges at the ICJ, it has to be recognized that the composition of the court and the election of the judges are still reflective of a political process. In other words, politics is still a factor, and Guyana therefore requires a narrative that goes beyond the legal narrative, one that has to be continuously repeated at every possible opportunity as an overriding foreign policy imperative. In this respect, we have to know all about the composition of the court and the nationalities of the judges. We have to develop close relations, or closer relations, as the case may be, with the countries the judges come from. I'm not suggesting that the judges would be easily swayed by political considerations, but reinforcing the strength of our case with the power of our diplomacy and the presentation of our country in the most positive light should not be underestimated. We also need to enlist the support of all multilateral groupings and forums with which we are associated, such as the EU, the Commonwealth, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, among others. We need to reinforce the support of our friends. We need to keep active on the diplomatic front. We cannot let our guard down. Now, with regard to the OAS, I should say that ever since we joined it in 1991, we have deliberately stayed clear of that organization as a forum for trying to resolve our differences with Venezuela, since we cannot run the risk of running foul of Latin solidarity with Venezuela. That is why we've always trusted in the primacy of the UN. But we should be ever vigilant in the OAS, and we should also seek to inform the membership of the OAS of developments in the process to guard against Venezuela eliciting sympathy for their position. When UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was considering whether to pass the controversy to the ICJ for settlement, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made the decision to do so. A significant factor was the quiet backing of key powers in helping the UN authorities arrive at a decision which they felt would enjoy widespread political favor. Now that the case is before the ICJ and the process is on the way, there should be no diminishing of diplomatic efforts to keep our friends apprised and to convince allies and others of the righteousness of our cause, and above all, to maintain support for the process and eventual acceptance of its outcome. I am personally glad that former Foreign Minister Greenidge has been retained by the Guyana government as the agent for the case. Not only is this a welcome sign of national unity, but it is also recognition of the primacy of the agent in the process, in terms of having a unified narrative, determining strategy, and attending to the convergence of the legal and diplomatic processes. The case is on the way. We cannot afford to lower our diplomatic guard while we wait for Venezuela's next move. If anything, we need to increase diplomatic efforts to keep international opinion well and truly on our side. And in this age of social media, we need all Guyanese, not just government officials and diplomats, but also journalists, members of civil society, and members of our diaspora to be advocates, to be ambassadors, to be champions of our united national narrative. Nothing can be taken for granted. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, an excellent explication of the need for us to stay vigilant. What I want to do now is to have David come in and offer. We've received many questions, and so David, if you can just take 2 minutes to knit things together, and then I'll bring the entire group together to kind of reflect on some of the questions that have come in. But we've received quite a few of them, so it's not clear that we're going to get to all of them.
Certainly, Terrence, and thank you all. This has been excellent by all our presenters, colleagues, and exactly what we knew was going to be the result. And I would just make a couple of points, underscoring many of these, and just then go into the discussion, because that's really the role here. I think, I mentioned the oil and gas economy convergence, and why it's important to focus on that, because it has serious implications in terms of the discussion of a challenge to Guyana's geographic and sovereign integrity. And I'm in the business world, and while I do agree with Professor Bryan as to the continuation of functional cooperation and so on, the need for vigilance is important, because many times governments fail to defend that national sovereignty because of the slippery slope of the comfort of business engagement with counterparts. And the oil and gas energy world is known for this. So that's one point there. I think also, and I'm glad that Riyad mentioned it, on the Venezuela side, many of us who have been supporting the democratic forces in Venezuela and against the Maduro regime and the illegitimate elections which have taken place, fail to sometimes bring to the forefront that those democratic allies in Venezuela are also as adamant as the regime in claiming Essequibo. So there's a big challenge there, and I'm glad that he brought that to the forefront. And there's a concern going on now with regards to the potential liberalization of sanctions on Venezuela, that can lead to a normalization of relations with that regime, and the implications that may have for the challenge and the controversy with Guyana that Venezuela is presenting, I think is something that needs to be focused on. And of course, you mentioned, Terrence, without calling it such, but there is also an extra hemispheric perspective to this, and the role that we are seeing from Russia, Iran, and China in the Americas, and potentially in this group of countries which are resource wealthy, not only in oil and gas, but many of the rare earth minerals which Ivelaw mentioned, and the attraction of those resources for political and foreign policy implications. So I'll just leave it at there, and please proceed with the Q&As and the discussions for us to get more richness from our colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much.
So one of the earliest questions that came in, and I suppose this one was for Foreign Secretary Greenidge, and I suppose anyone can pick it up now, because I think at some point he had to leave a bit earlier than. The question was, what are the chances? So Andre Brandy wanted to know, what are the chances of Guyana winning the court case in The Hague? I mean, how likely it is that we win? Does anyone have a sense of, the probability of win in this circumstance?
If I may, Terrence, I think it would not be wise for anyone to try to predict the outcome of a court case.
Yeah.
What I can say in Carl's absence, and knowing something about some of the work that the legal team has been pursuing, we have a very strong case. The fact that the Venezuelans were ever reluctant to go to court, that they didn't want to recognize the jurisdiction of the ICJ, and that they're employing delaying tactics, all of this points to the fact that they really don't have a case. But as I was saying, with regard to the legal process and the need for complementary diplomacy, nothing can be taken for granted. We can't just sit back and think that because our cause is just, because we feel that we are right, we would necessarily win the case. So it would not be helpful to try and predict the outcome of the case. We have to continue to persevere with efforts to keep the spotlight on the merits of our argument, on the truth of what took place ever since the 1899 award, and to counter the Venezuelan narrative of misinformation. But I don't know if anyone disagrees with me, but I don't know if anyone would be brave enough to try and predict the outcome of the case. But
So I think,
that is what I have to say.
I think you've rightly stated that perhaps it would be unwise to speak to a probability of the outcome in a court case. That's merely the fact that we do have an excellent team, and we will continue to be vigilant in prosecuting our case. The second question that arises, and this one came from Hugh Hamilton. So do we know precisely where Brazil and the United States stand in some official sense in terms of Venezuela's territorial claim, and you know, judging the likelihood, what kind of response can we see in some untoward situation where Venezuela attempts to enforce its claim? I mean, you know, one would think that there might be a Brazilian position on record, or a United States position on record, or are they just simply neutral parties who
I don't want to dominate this conversation, but since I was ambassador to the United States, I can say that the United States has been steadfast in its support for Guyana's territorial integrity, and very supportive both publicly and privately of the position that the 1899 award, in which a U.S. government played a critical role, should be respected. Brazil has similarly always respected the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Guyana, and has always been strong in its support of Guyana. I'd like to go back to something that David said, and this had to do with the irony that the one thing on which the Maduro regime and the Venezuelan opposition are united is their claim to our territory. They don't agree on anything else, but that is what they agree on. And even if Venezuela comes back into the fold with the reports we're getting of outreach being made to Venezuela because of the global energy crisis, we have to remember that Guyana is no longer a non-entity. We have assumed greater geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geostrategic importance because of our own oil and gas discoveries. And we are emerging as a player in this space. And we should not assume that because of that, others would jump to our defense, because we have to maintain our diplomatic efforts. But we are important, we are relevant, and that should stand in our favor.
So you've in a sense answered the question that kind of raised that. Should Guyana be concerned about the U.S. turning to Venezuela's oil in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war, and would that have an impact, you know, in this process? And I think in a sense you're saying that it is unlikely or less likely.
No, we can't be ignored. We're producing more and more. We produce a sweet light crude that needs minimal refining as opposed to Venezuela's heavy sludge. The Venezuelans need a massive re-injectment of capital to bring their industry up to where it used to be. And they will, at some point, produce more and more, and they will be relied on to be a supplier. But we, as I said, we are relevant. We're not going to be dismissed out of hand as others turn to Venezuela.
I think that's the opposite.
Terrence, I want to come back to the question of Brazil. And
I
think the question of Brazil highlights the reality that Venezuela's claim against Guyana involves much more than Guyana. If you were to remap Guyana and remap Venezuela in the image of what Venezuela has, there are broad implications for almost every country in South America. It would have an immediate impact on Venezuela's border with both Venezuela and Brazil's border with both Venezuela and Guyana. But not to forget that there still are some fairly dormant territorial claims and disputes elsewhere in the Americas. And so much as Tony Bryan said, the implications for Venezuela's claim on the maritime front in the Caribbean, from Brazil's standpoint, it would not want to reopen that Pandora's box where it not only in its national self-interest, But being the Leviathan of South America, it would have a role in trying to manage peace and resolve conflict elsewhere in South America. So Venezuela's claim against Guyana has much more than Guyana's existential threat insofar as threats are concerned.
May I, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
Can I make an observation here? First of all, I keep disappearing. You would have noticed. So I missed the first set of questions you may have put and the answers. But I just wanted to make 3 quick points here. So forgive me if they've been answered already. First of all, as regards Brazil, it needs to be said that the border between Guyana and Venezuela is a border that also meets with Brazil's border, at which border is one that had also involved a Brazilian claim on the territory that Venezuela currently claims.
Right.
We signed a tripartite agreement, which is an agreement that says this is where our borders meet. This is where the 3 borders meet. If any one of those countries decides that that borders agreement no longer stands, it is not something that Guyana alone can agree to. And I will say to you that I've had an instance in which a Brazilian minister says to me, when you decide to take any notice of Venezuela and even to consider that there is any justification for that claim, you better talk to us first. Meaning that Brazil has never agreed that it will cede territory to Venezuela in that area. It is to Guyana that. Secondly, very quickly, and so the question of reneging on one agreement is one that affects Brazil. So when people ask, I'm saying that they have to take into consideration that Guyana actually is not in a position to give what Brazil requests as regards that border. Secondly, as regards Professor Bryan's observations, please note 2 things. One, that 9 of the Caribbean territories already find that their territory is claimed by Venezuela as regards their maritime boundaries. It's not a potential threat. In fact, this was drawn to the Caribbean leaders' attention in the meeting in 2016. And that is what got many of those leaders suddenly paying attention to the decrees that Venezuela had issued, 1787, 1859 in particular. But these are pertaining to the maritime space. So that is the point I wanted to make as regards the question and this point that kept coming up as regards the position of our neighboring countries. Perhaps I should say also that in 2016, as a result of that exposure, as it were, even in the case of Suriname, the Caribbean heads instructed the SG, and I think it might have been the chairman of CARICOM who wrote to the Venezuelan president, telling him that they are very upset over these decrees that pose a threat to their patrimony. That was the term that was used. So that needs to be clear. It confirms the point that Professor Bryan was making as regards the Caribbean embrace of Guyana's position, notwithstanding the specifics of realpolitik. Their territories are under threat from the very decrees issued by Venezuela, including St. Vincent, for example, and Suriname. And bear in mind also that in the case of Suriname, the territory that Venezuela is claiming on the maritime space is territory on which the UN Law of the Sea Convention arbitration body has already pronounced an award which Guyana and Suriname have accepted. So you have here the problem of an attempt to buck the entire world as regards these boundaries.
So I know we're fast coming up on the close time, but there are 2 questions that I wanted to raise to you, and I hope you have just a moment to So the question is, one was raised, what is the best path to settling the maritime borders? And then the second question was, will a court decision in favor of Guyana settle the issue for good? We've had way more questions that I can put into, and so I wanted to know if you would take those two, and then I had one more from Dr. Chris Rampersad about the educational imperative, and I wanted to put that to you, Professor Griffith. So first, Carl Greenidge, and then Professor Griffith for the last question. Will the court decision settle it for good? Once we win, we never come back?
Unfortunately, I can't give that answer because that depends very much upon Venezuela. But there's a similar question which people also ask. Well, why do you go to the court? We go to the court, and the court decision is intended to solve at least part of the problem, and that's this part. We have problems in terms of investors, problems in terms of bilaterals, problems in terms of multilateral agencies. Who might have forgotten what happened in 1966 or what happened before? And therefore, you constantly get the question being asked. And it does appear that many of them feel, well, this is just something, a contention by two separate states. It can't be resolved, and therefore they leave it. The point is, if the court looks at the matter, just as the court was able to pronounce definitively that Venezuela, in fact, agreed that the court can look at the matter, then the question of the 1899 award can be definitively determined by the court. It isn't a question of Guyana says this and Venezuela says that. You have 16 judges drawn from elsewhere, including representative judges ad hoc, appointed by Venezuela and Guyana, who will pronounce on the matter just as they pronounce definitively on jurisdiction. And therefore, that itself will remove whatever justification Venezuela may want to rely on in terms of lack of clarity or our belief that it is A or B. The World Court, which stands at the pinnacle of the United Nations, will have pronounced on that dimension. Now, after that, of course, you can't, if they decide to buck the World Court, you can't say that they will not use another route to meet their means. But that will only be military, because there is no diplomatic or civilian mechanism for overthrowing that court's decision. So that's the importance of the court. It doesn't solve all the problems, but at least there can be no justification in terms of legal or diplomatic. And the best part for the maritime, if I may say very quickly, as far as I can see, would have to rely first of all on a court decision which confirms that this is our maritime space, this is the length of our coast, and this is Guyana's coast. Coming out of that, Venezuela and Guyana have to sit and resolve the matter. At this point in time, Venezuela says, well, there's nobody else apart from you says that is your coast, and therefore we are not sitting to discuss. After the seizure of the Techniques Perdana, we did meet with Venezuela with a view to discussing the maritime boundary. Venezuela refused. And so what is required now is for them to meet and discuss. If, having heard the court decision pertaining to the land, they refuse to adhere to the maritime boundary, then we are in a position to utilize the mechanisms that are generally utilized when two countries don't agree. And as I think Professor Bryan pointed out, I'm sorry if it weren't he, the fact is that Venezuela resolved their maritime boundaries with the Netherlands and France, utilizing third parties, which they now claim they don't use, to the mechanisms embraced by third parties. And the possibility here is for Guyana just to use the same mechanism that, say, you take the midpoint and you define the boundary from there. So in the case of non-agreement, you can use those.
Well, thank you. So so this question, I guess we're 4 minutes after 12. So Professor Griffith, you will get the chance to respond to this, and then we'll go to David to say thank you. This has been a really wonderful discussion. I want to comment on two things. One, in the advert for this program, I took a small snippet from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website that delineated the Guyana's maritime space, and someone called me and said, "Your picture juts out too far." And so I quickly went around and looked for another picture so as not to annoy anyone or to in this sensitive matter. And so I think this question brings us really forward-looking and tries to close this discussion. Dr. Chris Rampersad, talks about this public education imperative, but she notes that there's a technical lag that is clear, and we need to catch up. And perhaps there's a way in which, Professor Griffith, that we can use the digital world and integration to the digital world, social media, pop culture, to kind of create a new bridge from the academic world to the more to the broader society. And I just wanted you to kind of offer a few thoughts on that before we go.
Yep. Well, two things before, just one thing before I make a comment on that useful question, observation. And it's a footnote to what Carl Greenidge and Tony Bryan said. The threat to the Caribbean archipelago was laid out in 1975 by the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Eric Williams convened a special convention of the PNM, gave a very extensive historical treatment of why Venezuela has imperial designs in the Caribbean. And I think it would be useful to find that speech and just have it there as part of the public discourse. But Trinidad also played a critical role in the engagement Venezuela and Guyana by the Protocol of Port of Spain of 1970 that says, let's freeze this conversation about claim for 12 years. And let's think at the end of that 12-year period, do we want to renew? Matter of fact, the first time I went to Venezuela, 1981, was as the approach of that first 12 years was ending, I said, my boss said, let's go to Venezuela, interview people. That was an interesting week I spent in Caracas. So Trinidad has always had an importance attached to engaging in the dispute, in the claim by Venezuela, because the claim is to many countries, as Carl Greenidge said. I wrote a piece, I think it was 2 or 3 parts, May of last year, and I made the essential point that Dr. Rampersad is making. What we are doing in Guyana right now is necessary but not sufficient. We're not engaging in pop culture enough. We're not engaging multimedia enough. We are not even engaging the local Guyanese outside of the coast. I would say they are not, coming back to what Carl Greenidge said, the national conversation and winning the hearts and minds of your own. We've got a long journey to go in that respect. I would ask, for example, when last has there been a conversation with perhaps even the largest region of those 9, Region 9? When last has there been a conversation with putting some of the materials about a controversy in a language other than English? There's a significant constituency in Guyana that English is not their first language. Have the discourse reflected in those languages. Not only a large influx of Brazilians, but a large influx of Venezuelan, but Guyana has 9 First Peoples, many of which have owned. I was proud a couple of years ago in Rupununi to hear the Guyanese national anthem sung in Wapichana. So why not reflect the engagement of the people in languages that they embrace as their first language? So I absolutely agree that there's a journey we've got to go, and we've got to go it consistently, both depth and breadth.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. So I will hold out if anyone has any last burning thought that they need to put onto the record, and if Go ahead.
Can I just say very quickly, I have no difficulty with the points raised about the PR and the publicity. I agree with those initiatives, but I just want to say that for me, yes, it is important that you speak to your own populace, but the bigger challenge we now face is the international community. That PR has to be, is not to persuade the man in Mabaruma that this is his land. The challenge beyond the court is to persuade the man in Caracas and wherever else that this is not his land. So that is a dimension that needs attention, but all the others, including the point about using local languages, in fact, up to 2018, this was being done. That work in terms of whenever the Kushaus met each at their annual conference, a presentation was made. I can't say that it was made this year or last year because we have had other things on the agenda. But that is a forum we used for imparting such information. And there can be no doubt, we never have really done enough in that regard, at least not after 85.
David, you get to take us out.
No, you go ahead and close out, Terrence, because we're over time and so on. So please, I don't have anything more to add. Please.
Well, colleagues, given the time, I just want to thank you. It's been a real honor and a privilege, and I think it's been extremely informative. And given the questions that have come in, I think the viewership has been really, really heartwarming. And I think that there is an opportunity to continue to educate broadly Guyana and Guyanese in the diaspora on these matters. And I once again want to say thank you all very much for sharing this hour and a half with us, and also, to close on a word of memoriam. Maybe this was appropriate thing given the passing of Rashleigh Jackson, and I want to thank you all again for contributing, and wish you all a wonderful afternoon. Thank you once more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you,
Thank
Terrence.
you
all.
very-
Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very much.
colleague.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, colleagues. Have a wonderful rest. Yes.
I'd like to have a quick word with you afterwards, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, absolutely. No question about that.
Thank you.
You got it.
I had actually meant to call you by phone, but shall we do that? Because we don't need this, but I can do it here. It's not private.
Okay.
It's not private. So
So it's fine. Yeah.
I was going to say to you that I do have PowerPoints which can highlight the presentation if you want them, including a correct map.
Yes.
And the list of Caribbean countries which are under threat from Venezuela. I can have those